boy, here we are. I'm really, really excited for this one. We're here with a man who I haven't talked to directly before. We've only spoken off and on a few times, so I've been a great follower and admirer of his work. We were supposed to have him on a previous stream, and I'm saying this to kind of tee up what we're going to talk about. A few months ago, we had a stream with Stormy Waters and Tom Luongo where we were discussing the Bank of England and Europe's financial war in the US and sort of the movements of the dollar in international finance. So this is going to be in that same vein. And hey, Bloods, we might even get a modern monetary theory debate going on. And maybe Judas has finally proved wrong, or I'm proved wrong. You don't know what's going to happen. Here I am with Peruvian Bull, a man who needs no introduction. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. I've been looking forward to this, and honestly, we should have been doing this sooner, so I'm glad that we're here.
And people can check him out. He's got quite a few links, and we're going to get to that in a second, but right there on the bottom left, Peruvian Bull on X. Give that a follow. He's one of the best curators of his own stuff, and he's got a whole theory that we're going to get into, but it's very easy to read. It's got a lot of threads that goes into the history of what we're going to talk about. We're not going to get to everything, but we're going to do our best. And just to call attention, because you also wrote a book. Let me just see if I can throw this up on screen before we get started. So this is your book, The Dollar Endgame, Hyperinflation is Coming by Peruvian Bull. Glowing reviews. And this is on Goodreads, where everyone likes this shit. You're going to find like Lord of the Rings have a 2.5. So this is doing pretty well. I haven't read this, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to. Peruvian Bull, scholar, researcher, educator. My God, makes me look like a kettle of fish. So yeah, we're going to get into a lot of stuff. But before we do, I wanted to just show this brief trailer from this ongoing project that you're working on. This is a guy who produces little short videos and documentaries and things of substance. But this is a trailer for one of them, and this will kind of get people in the mood for what we're talking about. So here we go.
The global central banks are at a crossroads.
I think it's sped
After
up.
decades of zero-bound interest rate.
You have it at like.
I do. I usually play things on 125, but I can do it.
Yeah.
Rates and quantitative easing. Debt levels domestically and worldwide have reached critical levels. As the money printing bonanza of 2020 comes home to roost, dark feedback loops lurk under the surface of our economy, foreboding of a future of extreme inflation and financial devastation. The ships of state, unmoored from the tethers of hard money and taxation, have wandered into a maelstrom that threatens to destroy the very system we base our economic lives on. We are now entering a place from which few fiat monies have ever returned from alive. The Federal Reserve, the hegemon that runs the dollar-based global monetary system, is trapped in a black hole of its own design. They believe they can save themselves and the system. The terrifying truth is that we are not close to the event horizon, we're already past it. Only hard choices lie ahead. Welcome to the Dollar Endgame.
Now, this is exciting news for everyone who's into collapses, who's into accelerationism. And some people hear that and they say, yes, finally, let this hellish facade end. Now, before we get started on everything else, I do want to just ask you a very open-ended question, I'm sure. The dollar ends, let's say that happens within our lifetime. Is that good news or bad news for us? And by us, I mean those in the Western Hemisphere, let's say North America.
Well, I would say this is a complex and hard thing to answer, right? Because I would say it's both, It is a horrible thing in that it will destroy a lot of wealth. It will be a cataclysmic event, on par with, something like the extinction of the dinosaurs in terms of financial damage to the economy and to the world, because the dollar is the global reserve currency and it's used and intermediated in 80% of intercontinental trade. And so the dollar's death means that a massive power vacuum will open up globally and new players will step in and try to find solutions for, facilitating trade and for settling trade invoices. But overall, I think the dollar, especially as it stands right now, and I think most people would agree with this, right? The dollar stands as one of the bulwarks of protecting legacy institutions, right? So when you think of the Treasury, when you think of the Fed, when you think of every, the US aid and all those insane programs that they were funding, when you think of, all the higher education institutions in the US, all this is dependent upon a system that's entirely rotten to the core, not only in terms of its philosophy and its morality, but also in terms of its fundamentals, in terms of the math. And so the destruction of the system by nature means the destruction of the old order and the opportunity to lie or to birth something new. So it's painful in the short run, but in the same way that Weimar Germany was able to emerge after the ashes and grow into a regional power, right? It would sow the seeds for the U.S. to have a new golden age, I think.
And we're going to get into the details of the Bretton Woods system and everything you just said, but I'm going to hit you with another very big question, but something that we've talked about repeatedly on the show. Where do you stand on the BRICS currency? And by BRICS, for people who don't know, we're talking about the economic union between, what was it, Brazil, Russia, Iran, China, and South Africa. If you follow financial news, they've been talking about a new global currency to replace the dollar. Everything I've read from them says that we've got it, but we must wait for the dollar to collapse before we can move in. I was just sort of taking the temperature here. What do you think about the BRICS project? Does that seem realistic? Do you think there'll be something at the size of the dollar to replace the dollar? Or, as you seem to indicate, we might just reset to a different regional system entirely?
I think the BRICS move is entirely a bluff. And the reason why is because any new global reserve currency generally has to have a feature that is that puts it at a severe advantage above the prior currency. And the prior currency also has to be failing for a multitude of reasons. So if you look at the prior, transition from the British pound to the US dollar, in 1944, 45, the US had emerged with 50% of the world's above ground gold reserves. The US was basically unscathed in terms of its manufacturing and industrial output. The US had relatively low losses in World War II from, our later involvement in both theaters. And Britain was completely, in tatters, right? Their industrial and manufacturing base was damaged heavily. London was bombed many, many times during the Blitz. And they, over the course of the next 10 years, 20 years, they started to lose all their colonies, right? And so not only was there downward pressure on the pound as a reserve currency and the loss of their empire, but also there was a massive upward pressure in the dollar. The problem is when you have a reserve currency, you need to have an entrenched elite that understands what it is, understands how to protect it, and will take action to do so, often military action. And a BRICS alliance is nothing more than a loose confederation. And I use the word confederation in the loosest terms, right? Russia, India, China, South Africa, those 4 countries. Now, what do they have in common besides not liking the US dollar hegemony? They don't have, religion in common. They don't have race in common. They don't have common political structures. They don't even have common economics. They don't have common commodity sources or exchange markets. They don't have common philosophies when it comes to their external geopolitical stances. So really what it is more of a teaming up against the local high school bully kind of allegiance. And all of this doesn't even go to mention that the broadest problem and the biggest problem with a BRICS currency is the issue of actual settlement and storage. So if you have a commodities-based currency, and let's say you do it against a basket of gold and silver, and Russia, India, and China want to be the main players, well, is Russia going to agree to a system where all the gold gets shipped to vaults in China and China holds 100% custody? Probably not. India won't either. And would the other 2 of them do the same for India? No. So
we need an impartial third party. How about Canada, Australia, or some fucking?
Then Russia, India, and China will just claim, hey, those smaller countries, Canada is right next to the U.S. You guys are beholden to U.S. interests. We don't trust you to be a true custodian, right? And this is especially poignant in the aftermath of the 2022 tariffs and blockades, right, on Russia after their invasion of Ukraine. In February, the Treasury announced all these measures to block off Russian banks from SWIFT, which is the international banking network. And then the next month, in early March of 2022, they started seizing Russian assets, especially treasuries. And so, all of these things went to demonstrate the fact that the global monetary system, the global financial system, can be weaponized in times of war. So I think it was it $800 billion of Russian assets that month was seized and frozen. And obviously they had tariffs and punitive economic measures taken place to make sure that Russia would face economic consequences for their actions. But again, that just goes to show, like, if you have reserve currency and you can't trust the storage of that, and it's a commodity currency, you can't trust the storage of it to a rival like China or India, and you're Russia. Well, what do? The truth is, you don't have much that you can do besides just buying gold and waiting for the next system.
Yeah,
and so
that's
what all the central banks have been doing.
You raised a good point there. And in our geopolitical forecast, if we're talking about the strength of the unification, I don't see Brazil as particularly loyal to the project. In fact, if America were to retreat from its current security obligations, you could see them very well project force southward, which is what I know Peter Zeihan always talks about that. But I'm like, yeah, what you will lose them as an ally. It's really just China and Russia, if we're being honest. Those are the only two leaders in this. And I read a story saying, it was from Putin or Xi Jinping saying, the bear must now dance with the dragon. I was like, shut up. Shut the fuck up. Stop this be serious. It's a lot of flirtations. Don't you hate economic flirtations? Like you're just saying things to the press. We actually have a interesting question here from Sean Weiland on this topic. He had said, how about cryptocurrency as an impartial third party or as a way to store what we were just talking about?
Yeah, and so that's been a large part of the thesis for Dollar Endgame, is that cryptocurrencies, specifically Bitcoin, could potentially provide that third party, non-intermediated role of allowing transfer and custody of assets without having to rely on a custodian or a centralized entity. And Bitcoin specifically is the most secure, right? Most widely adopted, highest market cap, highest liquidity and depth of order book. So it's the highest likelihood of being taken on as a contender. But gold is also very, at least in the short and medium run, gold is also going to be used as a, you could call it like a transitional store of value, because gold allows the central bank to maintain its fiat currency, but also have a store of value mechanism so that they don't have their wealth devalued into nothing when the systemic reset happens.
All our libertarian listeners are just punching the air right now. Gold mentioned. This is a lot of people hearing things that they want to hear right now. Just looking through the comments right now. We're going to move on into a bit more detail, and I'm going to take us on a tour through some of your tweets and some of your tweet threads. We don't need to get into the details all that, but you oftentimes tee them up with these really great initial few posts, and then we can just sort of discuss that, because I want to lead into this idea of the financial singularity. And this is what we were talking about just a minute ago. The dollar is the world reserve currency. This grants immense geopolitical and economic hegemony to the United States, but Treasury wants to keep their Excalibur a secret, a thread. So what you're really talking about here is sort of the dollar dominance. And I believe it's this one where we mentioned around 40% of the world's debt is issued in dollars. It is the global reserve currency. Do we want to maybe discuss the Bretton Woods system just a bit and basically explain what point BRICS might have, which is that we want to upset the dollar hegemony. What is the dollar hegemony, and what are the consequences of that as it relates to politics even?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in the aftermath of World War II, right, we had this, especially, in the late stages of it, we had this global push from the monetary elites to try to find the solution for the next global reserve currency, because clearly the UK, right, Great Britain, had been heavily damaged by the war. They were likely to lose their colonies, even in the 40s. There were some political analysts that were forecasting that to happen. Although obviously the British state did not want that to be the end case, but it's the eventual outcome. And the goal was we need to find a reserve currency, an intermediary for the world to rebuild, specifically Europe, with the Marshall Plan, but also Asia, right? The goal was to transform Japan into an ally, especially as the Cold War was already starting to ramp up in the mid 40s, and fears of the Soviet strength were starting to be aggrandized in the halls of the CIA.
And also, just as a tangent, what is your opinion on Richard Werner? Because we also covered Princes of the Yen quite some time ago. Do you think that's a good analysis of Japan specifically?
Yes, that's an excellent analysis of Japan. I mentioned him in one of my recent mini documentary I made on YouTube, and he has a very, very unique take in that he has really covered the zombification, and you could call it like the stagnation and slow decline and death of the Japanese banking system, and the problems with having a centralized system where creativity and openness are already low in Japan and in Asian countries in general, and so their ability to innovate is less than Western countries, and so that just means that they've been exceedingly good at doing manufacturing optimization, so like making products cheaper, more efficient. But when it comes to actual innovation and growth, it's more difficult. And the Bank of Japan exacerbated that by creating a massive bubble and then by imploding it with their interest rate policy. But we can get into the Japanese yen later, because that's another interesting rabbit hole.
If I could just give a quick 2 points here. One, Bill Wilson raised, every time Dimes would say Iran was in BRICS, I had a mild aneurysm over the past few months. I swear to God, I looked this up from 2 different sources, and it was Iran, because in my mind, I thought it was India initially, and I thought, that's stupid. Why would it be India? What do they do? I looked it up just now. I don't know what's going on. It is India, but I swear to God, at one point it was Iran. Whatever. And then the Sex Frequent says they retconned it. That is the Vindaloo effect, of course. Yeah, and we'll save some of the Japanese stuff for later. I loved Richard Werner's analysis. I saw him on Tucker, and he really focuses in these interviews on sort of the blowing up of the Japanese economy, or rather making what they have, which is effectively a corporatist, you could argue a fascist government model, and then having to play by the American trade rules to enter into the global marketplace, because they could only produce and sustain themselves so much. So they had to basically barter their way into the economic global system by adopting and becoming what they are today, which I think makes sense. But the question is, he thinks that's bad. I question whether or not it was inevitable, if that is what you want to do, and what would that look like if America wasn't there. That's a very, very big topic, but I try and look at it dispassionately. You know what I mean? I'm like they were primed for growth, and this is what they needed to do. But anyway, I do wonder, if you want to participate in the global system at that scale, you just need to become like a service and consumer-based economy, which is what he's saying anyway.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting interesting discussion. We can circle back on that later, but yeah, so in the aftermath of in the later stages of World War II, right, this consortium of nations got together and decided on the new global reserve currency. And actually, John Maynard Keynes was proposing something called the Bancor, which would be a neutral reserve currency backed by commodities and issued by a central bank in Switzerland. And this central bank eventually became the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, and it's called the central banker's central bank. It's essentially, where a lot of the banking transactions are cleared through, and it's also where, SWIFT and other major international banking cartels have offices right next to the BIS, or even within, some of the BIS sub offices. But the goal was essentially, we need to create an intermediary currency for global trade. And the Bancor, which was first suggested by Keynes and later, supported by some of his adherents, was basically shot down at these meetings. And the main reason why was because the U.S. wanted to capitalize on its newly gained position as basically a new world superpower. And the Banco idea, after a couple weeks of debate, was slowly shot down, and the U.S. dollar became the main thrust of their argument, using a dollar exchange rate. The problem was all these you could call it like subsidiary fiats, like the pound and the franc and the German mark and all these other countries were worried about their gold parity exchange rates, because the problem had emerged post World War I. Because prior to the war, all the countries had been on a gold exchange standard. Like the mark was on, like, I think it was 4 marks for a gram of gold or something like that. And that was the pound. I think it was 4 pounds for an ounce of gold. And after the war, even though they devalued by 100 or 200% in terms of like the fiat monetary base had expanded, they tried to go back. The British tried to go back to their pre-war parity, which caused a economic recession in Britain in the early 1920s. And the recession was so severe it actually turned into a depression, and it kind of foreshadowed the American Depression that came later on. And so all these countries were worried about going back to the old gold exchange system, because they didn't know what the true market clearing rate of their currencies would be after all this annihilation, all this destruction, and all this currency manipulation, right? With each central bank printing money to fund their own war. So they said we're all going to fix our exchange rates to the dollar. We're not going to fix it to gold. We're going to fix it to the dollar, and we're going to have the dollar be fixed to gold. And so therefore we'll all be indirectly fixed to gold. And the dollars will serve as an intermedium between us and the gold market, but we won't have to worry about our actual gold convertibility, because again, in other times, like pre 1900s era, a country would actually have to redeem all of their fiat currency for gold. Meaning, if you go into the bank, you can redeem your pounds for an ounce of gold, or redeem your francs for gold. And bank runs therefore were common, as well as current account deficits and current account surpluses could cause gold to flow into nations or flow out. And so they said, we don't want this chaos. We're going to just all peg it to the dollar. The dollar has 50% of the above ground gold reserves. So we're just going to trust that they don't inflate anymore, because they're the least affected economy. And so they set the exchange rate $35 an ounce and pegged all of their fiat rates to the dollar at specific intervals. And they were set in very tight bands. And if they moved even slightly out of that band, there was intervention on the central bank part, or on the commercial bank part, via swaps. And so everything was kept in a really tight line for a couple decades, and it was working until it didn't. And that's where Triffin comes in.
Now, a lot of people, and we've discussed this on the show, have discussed the move away from the gold standard. A lot of libertarians despise that. A lot of, even some economists despise that. And that was the dawn of what some have termed creditism, where you could effectively make as much money as you want because it's just numbers on a spreadsheet. You're moving commas around. It's just ledgers and creative accounting. And of course, there's central banks involved. But with the dollar hegemony maintained, but the break from any sort of gold backing, would you say, is that description accurate, that we're living in that sort of world where hypothetically you can print infinite money? That's what some of the modern monetary theorists say. What do you think about that?
Yes. I mean, hypothetically, yeah, you can print into infinite money. The problem is the externalities, right? The third order effects that you get from that, right? So printing infinite dollars, for example, would flood not only the markets, the stock markets, the bond markets with money. It would eventually flood into the real economy and cause massive, consumer price inflation, which would make life unlivable for all of us.
Which is very close to what happens. My contention was that, or the way it's described by modern monetary theorists, I'm curious to hear your view of this, is that this is where we get into discussions of spigots. All it is, to improve society, you just must open the spigots of credit over industries that can absorb credit and scale, which tend to be previously manufacturing. Now it's anything to do with technology. So examples would be quantum computing, AI, renewable energy is kind of one, but it has diminishing returns, it seems. But anyway, they just think more money. And the idea was, if you can open hypothetically infinite money over things that can absorb capital and scale, you wouldn't see as many externalities. Whereas if you open up the spigots over people, over the consumer market, that immediately drives up inflation. And one thing I had proposed to my co-host, and this is what I'm curious to hear you about, is if we look at what happened during the COVID lockdowns, I believe they released something to the tune, and correct me if I'm wrong, like $3 trillion, and they just found it, made it out of thin air, gave it around. And to me, the inflation, there was inflation, but it wasn't correlated directly with the insane amount of capital that was released, which tells me they're not directly correlated, or there's something else going on. What do you think about that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is my contention with the gold bugs. This is one of my problems with them, is that, I was a, in my much younger years in 2011 and 2012, I was an early teenager, but actually no, I was like 14, 15, but I was very, very tuned into economics. And I was watching, Peter Schiff and Mike Maloney and those kinds of guys, and I was seeing them on TV. And even like there were ads I remember running in the early 2010s saying that you need to buy gold, get this gold eagle on discount. Like gold's going to go to 5,000, gold's going to go to 10,000. Hyperinflation is going to come tomorrow, because the Fed had just started their QE2 program in 2012 and launched another round of quantitative easing. And obviously they'd go on later to blow their balance sheet up to, $4.5 trillion, and then eventually to $9.5 trillion by 2020 and 2021. But the problem that they didn't understand is that the Fed buying assets is not the same as directly printing money. It is printing money, it's creating bank reserves, but those bank reserves are trapped within the financial system because they're trapped as ledger entries within the Fed's SQL ledger, which is their what's called their master account or master ledger, which is essentially money for banks and for financial institutions. And so the main conduit, which I only found through doing research on monetary plumbing, the main conduit for turning asset price inflation or asset price money, right, bank reserve money, financial system money, into commercial money, meaning what you and I use, is treasury deficits. So there was, around $4 to $4.5 trillion of total easing between 2008 and 2014, and yet inflation went nowhere. And that tells you that there was a couple things at play. First, obviously, there was disinflationary pressures from the recession, obviously, but two, the deficits weren't that high, the fiscal deficits. And so that meant that the dollars weren't flowing out into the real economy. And when people ask me, like, give me the 50 IQ, explain how this works, it's really simple, right? Treasury goes and issues a bond. Those bonds are sold to what are called the primary dealers. Those are banks that are authorized to trade with the Treasury directly on their securities, and then they broker that same sale to other banks and other institutions who want treasuries. Okay, so the Treasury sells, a bond to a bank. That bank gives them what's called a bank reserve, because the bank doesn't have the same sort of cash that you and I have. They don't have deposits. They have bank reserves that are held with the Fed. So they send the Fed, or they send the Treasury bank reserves that are held at the Fed. When the Treasury goes and spends that money, there's a magical button that's pressed for it to become M2 money supply. And the reason why is I say it's magical because that money, by definition, has to be spent in the real economy. When the Treasury gets money, they don't want to spend it on financial assets, right? I mean, there is obviously examples of that, like TARP and TAMP and other Treasury programs post-2008 that were meant to bail out, toxic mortgages. But by and large, most government spending is mainly directed at the real economy. It's mainly directed at Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense, right? And then other forms of entitlements. And so that means that the money that's held at the Treasury General account is by definition spendable. If you Google Treasury General account, it'll come up with might have a good AI overview of it. But that also means that when the Treasury General account is utilized to a larger and larger extent, which was what happens during deficits, because you're borrowing more and more money and spending more and more money, that spigot opens wider. So again, you have this huge tank of liquidity and capital in the financial market, and then you have a spigot, which is the Treasury General account. And during 2010, 2012, 2014, that spigot was barely flowing. because the fiscal deficits weren't that high. We're talking 2 or 3% of GDP. Now the fiscal deficit is running steady state at 7% of GDP. And we're not in a major war, and we're ostensibly not in a recession, right? And so if that's the case, like, what's going on? It's clear that we're facing an economic crisis, I think, that's still reverberating from COVID. But that's also why we've had this inflationary wave since 2020, is because for the first time, we had not only the liquidity from the Fed being created, all the capital, but we had a spigot that would transfer it into the real economy via treasury spending. And so all that cash flowed to baby boomers, flowed to the PPP loan program, flowed to the stimulus checks, and it became M2 money supply, because you send it to real people, and those real people need bank deposits, and the banking system has to transition those bank reserves into bank deposits, which increases the M2 money supply by 40% in 2 years, and then that explodes inflation upwards.
That's an amazing analysis of, and we're going to get back to that in a second. I need to get to a super chat we received from my good friend Sean Weiland, who works in wealth management. Him and I talk economics all the time. We had him on the show a while ago. He asked you thoughts on John H. Cochran's fiscal theory of the price level, especially as it's promoted by the PayPal mafia, including Curtis Yarving and Mike Green. Does that sound familiar?
I haven't read up on John H. Cochran's theory, but I'll read it, and I can come back next time and talk about it.
Yeah, Sean, if you've got some notes on that or a summary, I could throw that up on screen too, and we can discuss that. This guy, I get a lot of my economics books from Sean Weiland, and then we argue about it, and we say each other's wrong, but I'm the one who takes like cues from him. We did a whole arc not long ago on Soviet economics, explaining, because everyone talks about the fall of the Soviet Union, but not a lot of people discuss the reform movements, the economic reform movements that were occurring within the Soviet Union, the middle income trap and things like that. Because a lot of people in our spaces will talk about America as it's the great economic Satan, things of that nature. But I think an important dimension of that discussion is, well, why did this system dominate? And it's not just because one side was necessarily more manipulative than the other. Look at it dispassionately, look at it cynically if you must, but say, what are the mechanisms within this model that led to its dominance? And then once you understand how it works, most importantly, we can discuss how it could collapse, which is what you're talking about. Because again, other people on the flip side in our space will say that, well, this system will never fail. It will be turbo America until the heat death of the universe. It always bounce back. And I don't subscribe to that either, which is why I find your theory so interesting. Don't get so comfortable that you think that the music can't stop within our lifetimes. And there's so many people who are looking ahead to, what does this look like when the baby boomers are not present anymore? No one's really talking about that. That's pretty fucking scary. Where's all that money go? I don't know. What are your theories on that?
On the transition, or like the end of the dollar?
Let's say the baby, let's say how much capital and money, the money supply, is held up by boomers in their investments. Let's just even say their bank accounts. Once they are not around anymore, where do we think that money might go? Well, just go back to the banks even.
Yeah. So here's I guess maybe this is a little bit of a black pill, but there's a couple different things that are going to happen. First off, obviously the baby boomers are the largest and most wealthy generation in U.S. history. I think as of last count, they're 86 or 88 million strong, and 10,000 baby boomers retire every single day. So they're a massive force. And Stormy has a thesis that their retirement and then their eventual death is going to put a massive selling pressure on the housing market specifically, but also on equities and bonds. And I think that that's largely right, because they were the first and the main generation to generate capital and to pour that capital into housing and equities and stocks, and bonds, excuse me. The problem is, baby boomers, first off, they're the least likely generation to transfer their assets to their children. If you rank by Pew Research surveys, they're also the most likely, obviously, to donate to political causes or to donate their estates to some form of political cause. And so what we'll likely see is a mix of, a massive asset inheritance that doesn't come until their kids, which are millennials or maybe Gen Xers, are kind of late in the game. Like their kids will be 40 or 50, and then they get finally some cash and a house, or those funds will be donated to political causes or even to the government, essentially, right? Because if, as far as I understand it, in some states, if you don't designate people in your will, the government can seize some of your assets. And
Yeah,
so,
it's funny. We were talking about this on the last episode of our show. I don't even know if this is correct, but it feels correct, and I'm going to say it anyway. It seems that with older liberals, especially, they're the ones, even though they don't talk about that much, they're the ones who give it to their kids, their fail sons, their dumb daughters, whatever, or their political causes. They'll actually donate
Mhm.
to their own politics. Whereas the right wing boomers, they might have an ideological position against that, so they don't want to give it to their kids, so they just fucking burn it. Like, so it doesn't go to work at all. They would like rather
Mhm.
spend it smashing cigarette boats together, from the sounds of it. And so you wonder, where's all the right wing money? I'm like, it's up into grandpa's arm. They're all into
Mhm.
heroin now. You know?
Yeah, and it's unfortunate, right? Because, and I've had some boomers get mad at me online, and I love boomers. My dad's a boomer, my mom's a boomer. My dad was born 51, and my mom was born 55, and so they're firmly in that camp. But I think the problem is many of them just grew up and lived in a different world than the rest of us have, and so they don't remember seeing America's economic decline. They don't remember seeing our demographic decline. They don't remember seeing our political conversation be this polarized and heated. And so when you bring up things like this, like, hey, you need to donate to your kids, you need to do this, they go back to their 1971, you know, job at the gas station where they're making enough to buy a house in 3 years working at a gas station. And they think if you're not successful, you're lazy. Why are you being a lazy bum? I don't need to give you anything. You can earn everything yourself. Even though the, average time to earn a house has gone up something like 7x since the 50s. So that's kind of caused this generational disconnect, right? And I do know what you're talking about. There is definitely a reluctance on the right to give things to your kids. It's like a earn it or lose it kind of mentality. And it's unfortunate because, again, I don't believe in handouts either, but I also understand the idea of creating something to pass on to your children. It's like the same idea of creating a ranch that's a generational ranch. Like, wouldn't you want to be able to pass on that ranch to your kids and have it be a profitable business for them? Should we burn every ranch at the end of a family cycle so that the next family has to start off from ground zero with no animals and no
Yeah.
pasture and no fences and no barns?
It's
Like, does
ironic
that
because
make
it
any
seems
sense?
the liberals, because they're so critical of the system, they have a fundamental distrust of the system. So there's a stronger belief in dynasties, whereas with conservatives, and I'm painting with a very broad brush here, but
Mhm.
I think there is some truth to the fact that they still believe in the system and they're less cynical about it. So they still think you can do what they did. And I think they really believe that. Whereas perhaps
Mhm.
the liberals or leftists or whatever are willing to put their thumb on the scale for their kids because they don't have that ideological presupposition.
Yeah, yeah. And there are exceptions, obviously. Like, one of my friends is Ben Wehrman. He's a really great Twitter guy, a little conspiracy theorist, but it's fine. And he grew up on an island near where I live in Washington. And his parents told him that when they die, all their stuff is going to be donated to political causes, and he gets nothing. And he's their only son,
And they sound
and
I had
they're
my
like happy
wife's
about it.
father-in-law say that, like, he was smiling and laughing, like, you guys aren't going to get anything. I'm like, well, first of all, you're broke. We make more money than you, so whatever. But it's the sentiment that bothers
Mhm.
me. But then what I notice is that generation, because I think my mom might have been Gen X, I'm not sure, but they seem like the first big generation that put their parents into homes. So they're at once saying, you're going to get nothing. But so many of them are deathly afraid of being in a nursing home because they did that to their parents and they desperately don't want you to do it to them. But then they're stuck in this sort of dissonant space where I'm like, well, okay, if you want me to be your nurse, then can I get some money? It's like, no, I'm gonna blow it on condos until I'm dead broke, and then you can nurse me to death. Like, okay, well, I mean, I wouldn't do that to my kids, I don't think. Anyway, we're getting into a boomer talk right now. It always happens. We got a dear point, Marco. I'm still optimistic, sir. You got to be optimistic, otherwise, why get up in the fucking morning, right?
Yeah.
Now, moving on, I just wanted to get off the boomers. The dollar as a world reserve currency has allowed the U.S. to subjugate the entire world to become an empire. And you give some really great examples here. And I was interested to hear a bit more about the consequences of the American dollar hegemony. How has that allowed it to project power? Did you want to give like a couple examples about how this relates to central banks? Because even a comment earlier was trying to sort of figure out how these seemingly independent central banks around the globe factor into this larger system.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, there's a couple of good examples. Also, if you go back to the previous thread and scroll down, there'll be some good examples of, for example, the Treasury using the dollar as like a weaponized, security, as essentially like forcing banks and countries to acquiesce just by threat of tariff. But really, the way the system was set up in the aftermath of Bretton Woods, and then even in the aftermath of the closing of the gold window in 1971, was such that it created and reinforced American hegemony and American power by the very nature of the system, right? So in the aftermath of the gold window closing, the US dollar and all other fiat currencies began to trade freely against each other. And obviously we had oil shocks and the geopolitical crises of 1973 and 74, 75, which caused massive inflation in the US. And the dollar quickly became unstable, and we needed to find some new medium of creating dollar demand. And luckily, in the background, there were already two things happening. There was already the petrodollar, which was put forth by Henry Kissinger and kind of cemented in later agreements in Saudi Arabia with OPEC in I believe it was 79. And then there's also the Eurodollar system, which is talked about by Jeff Snyder. And that is basically like a shadow banking system that works on essentially like synthetic US dollars, but backed partially by real dollars that facilitates global trade and commerce. So like that previous infographic said, 40% of global debt is invoiced in dollars. Around 59% of all foreign exchange reserves are in dollars. 80% of global interregional trade is in dollars. 55% of trade invoices are in dollars, right? So the dollar dominates in basically all forms of international trade and finance. And what that means is that functionally, first off, the US is the only fiat currency which has external demand for their large persistent external demand for their currency and for their bonds, right? Because their bonds are just a form of their money that's time delayed, that pays out, given a coupon rate and a maturity date. And no other fiat currencies has that, right? So when the US goes to market and needs to sell debt, there are other countries who structurally need the debt because generally they need to offset, a corresponding dollar liability that they have, and they need to have an income stream to offset that. So all these other countries need dollars, so they buy dollars from the US, and they can get those dollars, either by straight out buying them on a forex market. They can get them, mainly by interregional trade. They can get them by borrowing them in the trade markets, and that creates more and more dollar debt, which also consistently reinforces the dollar demand, because every new dollar of debt that's created creates more demand in the future, because that dollar of debt must be paid off, right? And so what's happened is that the dollar basically started to proliferate throughout the global financial system. And so, yeah, here's an example, right? The US in 2012 froze Iranian bank for doing basically what they called a non-sanctioned action that they didn't agree with. And the UK banker was like, what the fuck is going on? Like, this is not, possible. This is not cleared by the UN, and the US went forward anyways. And if you scroll farther down, there are other examples. There's a French bank. Where is it? I thought it was a little further. Scroll up. That's too far. There's a French bank. I don't know if I put it in this one, that was fined like $14 billion in 2014. Let's see. Bahrain, Deutsche Indites. Okay, I think you slow down, go back down. I thought it was a French bank, but yeah, there's a couple other Deutsche chartered. Yeah, there it is. Chartered to pay 1.1 billion. There's a couple other examples of all these banks who are not registered in the U.S., not chartered in the U.S., and aren't liable to U.S. political pressure, at least on the surface. And they were forced to pay fines or to, be cut out of SWIFT, which is the international, essentially like the banking communication code, which helps with clearing and settlement. If they don't.
By the way, I'm trying to click that
US
link for
policy.
chartered, and it wasn't opening. It just went back to the main writers page
Oh,
because some
shoot.
may be
Okay.
taken down.
Well, this is an older thread, so some of the links might have broken. But you can click the Deutsche Bank link one, the Deutsche Bank one. Let's try that. The Guardian one. See if that works. Oh, what? All
They're
these
trying
links
to
used to
fuck
work.
with us.
Okay. No,
this is just like the Iran India thing. They're trying to make us look foolish, and I'm not party to that.
Yeah. I promise you, these are real headlines that I pulled up.
Oh no, obviously they are. It's these fucking websites. Like they take. Like I was pulling up some other articles because they're always trying to predict geopolitical moves, and I saw one. It was from some council, and it's like there's like 3 revisions. It's like we had to revise this article because Saudi Arabia didn't do what we predicted they would. So sometimes they just like take them down for various reasons. But sorry, I probably derailed us a little bit with that. Let me just pull this.
Yeah, back. Here's one. I'm going to DM this to you. French bank to pay 8.83 billion in sanctions pro BNP Paribas. Yep, this was it. I'm going to DM this to you on Twitter. And that's even NPR, right? So that's a liberal news organization. But the point is, the U.S. through their ownership of the dollar settlement and clearing system, right? They are the ones responsible for settling the majority of global trade. And so if you're doing something, if you're a French bank and you're doing trade with Iran or North Korea or Russia or someone that the US doesn't like, the US can pressure its intermediaries and its constituents in Switzerland to cut you out of the global banking system, or to fine you, or to do all these other kind of, you could call it extrajudicial actions. And that basically means that the global financial system is run by the US. So if you violate that order, if you do something wrong, they will cut you out from the system and you won't be able to transact. And again, most people use the dollar. So if you're not able to use the dollar, and 9 out of 10 of the top foreign exchange pairs are US dollar as one side of the leg. So USD JPY, USD EUR, USD GBP, the USD Canadian dollar, it's all dollar based. So if you're cut out of using the dollar, you're basically fucked as a bank. You can't do much. And so the US has been able to use this cudgel to walk around and just beat people over the head and be like, no, you have to listen to us. No, you have to do what we say. And this was again expounded upon in Juan Zarate's Treasury. It's called a Treasury War, which is his retelling. He was the Undersecretary of the Treasury in I think 2012 to 2016, and he talked about how they weaponized this actively, how they went ahead with using this as a tool for political, arm twisting to make people and make countries do what they wanted.
I'm just trying to look up the Treasuries War book here. I found something that's not just Amazon. I think I might have found it here.
Treasuries, it's called Treasuries War. Juan
History
Zarate.
of Future, is that one? Maybe. Anyway, I might have got the wrong one, but sorry, we had a couple interesting questions here. I want to get to them before I forget. We have Deerpoint Macro saying, just a question, put out a tweet today, 100 billion foreign official treasury sales spikes, 10-year yields, 80 BPS in our data. Doesn't that suggest selling raises dollar demand rather than triggering de-dollar? I assume that one's for you. That one's probably not for me.
Yeah, no. I know Deerpoint Macro, he's a really great guy and far more far more deeper on the macro stuff than I am, right? Because I'm just a macro analyst who does this as a Substack writer, and I believe he's an institutional guy. But yeah, so if you the problem is that the system is entirely what I would say counterintuitive, right? From your first thought. So he's essentially saying that the foreign official treasury sale spikes. So if they're saying selling dollar, oh, okay, selling dollar debt raises dollar. Oh, okay, I see what he's saying. I see what he's saying. Well, where's it first? Okay.
Yeah, this would be the second part to it. Just seems there's literally no other alternative. And as you mentioned, each dollar liability must be offset by a dollar asset to ALM, just so it seems like this will continue to grow and grow. I'm saying this for the people who listen on audio later too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, my first question to your point was going to be, how did you, estimate that dollar demand increased that day, given that the treasury yield spiked? But you're exactly right. Yes. The system is entirely basically set to one dial or one switch, which is a grow. And the reason is because obviously debt continues to grow globally and the borrowing continues to grow. And so that just means that more and more dollar debt begets more and more dollar debt and more dollar demand. And so it's a self-feeding cycle. It continues to grow and grow and grow and ensures that other countries have a harder and harder time over time getting out of their dollar liabilities. And if they try to switch back to their own currencies, and I'm sure Deer Point, knows the details on this, borrowing costs rise significantly. So if you're an Indonesian palm oil manufacturer, or if you're an Iranian oil supplier, or if you're a Congolese diamond mine, if you borrow in your local currency, you'll be paying 400, 500, 600 basis points more than you would in US dollars if you take on US dollar debt. And so that's why many of the largest corporations in the world, even if they're domiciled in countries like Japan or China or India, will take on dollar debt just because the funding is much cheaper. And so it's much easier for them to load up on more and more debt because there's more supply of that capital. And then that just means now that they have an even more ingrained reason to earn dollars and to offset that dollar liability with other dollar assets. So they recycle whatever dollar holdings they have back into US equities and back into US bonds. And so that creates this positive feedback loop of more dollar debt means more dollar liabilities, which means people need more and more dollars, which means they buy more and more assets. And so it's this like dollar milkshake like effect that that Brent Johnson talks about. And he's really the progenitor of that theory. And that just reinforces the dollar hegemony forever. But the problem is it makes the system break upwards instead of downwards. So the dollar breaks, or the system breaks because the dollar gets too strong, not because it gets too weak.
I have a question for you. There's been many commentators in our spheres who were looking towards what Trump was doing, and there's talk of reshoring manufacturing. There's talk about America becoming more isolationist. And when I look at the financial system as it stands right now, it seems to me that, let's say all that's true, I don't think there's any real shift in this dollar hegemony that can be acted by a president. I guess the question would be, is there anything any sitting president can do to really affect or disrupt this system? Or is it just this runaway train that we're kind of all along the ride for now anyway?
No, there are absolutely things you can do. But remember, like, there are always second and third order consequences to disrupting the status quo, right? So basically, and Luke Roman lays this out really well. And I'm sure Deer Point Macro has read up on Luke Roman's writings of this. But he essentially points out that, right, this push towards globalization, towards offshoring manufacturing, towards increasing the trade deficit and increasing the current account deficit in order to send out more and more dollars to the global economy on net, has benefited Wall Street and especially corporate America to a disproportionate extent. So, you look at their margins, you look at their earnings ratios as compared to where they were in the 2000s, because now their costs are much lower. They're able to produce things for much cheaper because their manufacturing bases in China or Indonesia or Thailand or whatever. And that allows them to boost their earnings artificially, and which boosts their stock price, which helps Wall Street and corporate America make more and more money. But that essentially disenfranchises or, disintermediates the Rust Belt, the normal working Americans, as a source of labor and overall manufacturing output. So because those jobs aren't going to Ohio or to Tennessee or Kentucky, and they're now going to Shanghai and Hanoi, that means that all that capital is being siphoned overseas and then recycled back into financial assets. So it leads to an increasing of the wealth divide and a bifurcation of America. And so I think overall it's problematic. And if you wanted to stop it, you could, theoretically, but it would just cause a lot of damage because suddenly all these people who are earning fat checks and all these companies that are propped up on offshoring their manufacturing base now have to reshore, and now their prices triple, and now their stock price collapses. They're not going to be happy about that.
Yeah, and just for the record, I'm not one of these collapse fantasy guys. Even if we believe any sort of collapse is inevitable, we try and temper those sort of speculations with it'll be very, very bad, probably for you materially, for all of us. So, there's so many people in our spaces that are looking forwards to the collapse of the system, and then something new can be reborn from the ashes. But there's only the vaguest idea of what that would look like. And, always look towards the technology sectors. And I think there's a reason why America specifically does so well technologically. All the, BRICS advocates and multipolarity guys want to talk to me about how much shitty steel China is producing and how that's going to spell the death of America. But, I'm trying not to let my biases cloud my judgment. Hey, maybe we need a fucking mountain of shitty steel. What do I know? Hey, maybe that's as good as quantum computing, I guess. Anyway, we're going to move on to the singularity. And I know this is going to relate to everything we were just discussing and on the topic of collapse, but we got a really great thread here. The singularity, there exists a hidden flaw in the monetary system deep into the black hole that could spell disaster for fiat currencies. So did we want to take this into that direction? Could we explain a bit more about what the singularity is? What does that mean for us?
Sure. So this is actually going off the back of one of my most viral threads, which was the monetary event horizon, in which I talked about, at what point does the debt level get so big that it starts becoming a, self-feeding monster, in the sense that you can't tax your way into paying it off. You can't grow your way into paying it off. And the only option is essentially print. Right. So that's a monetary event horizon. That's where you've entered a monetary black hole, and there's no escape. And the only way is complete debasement or some form of, severe deflation. And this thread specifically goes into the more technical monetary plumbing, which I touched on earlier, which is that when the Treasury initiates spending, when they, sell a bond at auction and then spend it into the real economy, that creates M2 money supply. And that M2 money supply is bank deposits, right? It's CDs, it's money at money market funds, and it circulates in the real economy and drives up prices. And so the hidden spigot is the fiscal deficit. And that's what all the gold bugs and all the neo-Austrians and all the libertarians missed back in 2011 and 2012. That's the key to creating inflation. And so that's probably why, we're sitting at, a time when the Fed just lowered rates at 25 basis points. We have inflation still above their 2% target, and we have fiscal deficits at 7% with the Fed doing a taper, because the fiscal deficits are part of the equation to creating inflation. And if you have persistently high deficits that are big enough, you can create persistent inflation. And I think that's what most economies have seen play out in the real world. The one exception you could maybe argue would be Japan, and Japan is a very unique outlier in many, many cases, because it's the highest in terms of overall debt to GDP. It's the highest in terms of financialization of their stock market, meaning the Bank of Japan owns 50% of the entire JGB market. They own 60 to 70% of the 10-year JGBs and over 100% of certain issuances. But this spigot, right, this fiscal spending spigot is the key. And so if we enter another easing cycle with high deficits or even higher deficits, let's say there's a war tomorrow in Europe, and Russia decides to invade Poland and go further west into Germany, and the U.S. has to launch a counteroffensive. And so we send over 2 million men, and we launch a massive offensive, and there's trillions and trillions of dollars, and the Treasury borrows, and deficit to GDP suddenly jumps to, let's say, 15%. So it doubles from where it is now. If that happens, the money that's being created by the Fed will be flowing into the Treasury, and then the Treasury will be spending it on, war munitions, on tanks, on planes, on soldier salaries, on all those things. And all that money will flow back into the real economy eventually and cause asset price inflation. And that's the singularity. If the Treasury gets stuck in a fiscal deficit loop, it will enable the proliferation of inflation as we go further into the monetary black hole, as the debt rises. So that's the singularity. That's the problem that we're now facing.
How has in your opinion, and I haven't looked at this all, how has the war in Ukraine, in your view, affected not America, but the Russian economy? I know it's a different sort of international trade model, but do you think it's looking okay for them, or where do you stand on that?
You mean how has the sanctions affected them?
Not even the sanctions, but when we're talking about expenditures of both human capital and investing into this war, do you think that has bolstered their economy, or do you think even if there's a ceasefire because this war has gone on much longer than I think even most of the hawkish people thought it would, do you think that Russia is significantly economically disadvantaged by this war, or would keeping that momentum going, and let's say they move to Poland, let's say they move to Germany, would that benefit them?
I don't think that this war is beneficial. I think rarely are wars beneficial in terms of economics, because it destroys so much of a country's industrial base and manufacturing base, as well as their young men, right, which are the drivers of future family formation. They're also the people most likely to work long hours, right? Work harder to get raises and promotions, and decimating that population basically hampers your ability to form viable and strong economic growth in the future. So I don't think that this benefited them on net economically. I think for them, it's much more of a geopolitical gamble, right? Russia is essentially a giant wheat field. They have a massive open border on their western side, which they've been invaded through by Napoleon and by Hitler. And so having two successive armies walk through this giant grass field and walk all the way to your capital is pretty jarring for a nation state of that size. And so I think that their goal with Ukraine, and with maybe their strategy with those Soviet states in general, was to create a buffer zone between them and what they perceive as their enemies, which is the West. But I think more broadly, it was shocking to them to have their assets seized in the aftermath of their invasion. I think they probably anticipated that to some extent, but the speed at which that the U.S. authorities froze and seized their U.S. Treasury holdings and their gold holdings and whatever other security holdings they had in the U.S. and the U.K. and Switzerland was pretty astounding. And it also showed that the U.S. is not afraid to overtly weaponize their control of the financial system when they deem fit.
That's a great analysis. Before we move on to the next part, I just need to once again throw it to Sean Weiland. I see what he's doing, Sean. Look at this. Look at this. Financial repression. This is why John Cochran's fiscal theory price level is so relevant. He has not explained what that is yet. Sean's a very sick man, you understand. He's a very diseased mind. So he does things like this. He tries to get a water cooler thing going. Everyone's talking about this John Cochran fiscal theory. I don't know if it's even real. You tell me what it is, Sean, and then we'll talk about it. We'll hash it out. All right. Yeah. So this was another. Continuing on the singularity, there's an accelerating withdrawal of money throughout the entire system. Can we speak to that a little bit? What are the other corollaries and the other markers you're seeing, and what does that exactly mean with the withdrawing of the money?
Sure. This was a more, I guess you call it, contemporary piece that happened right after, if you look at the timestamp, May 4th, 2023. It was right after the Silicon Valley Bank blew up, and also after
and yeah, if you want to talk about Silicon Valley Bank and what that means or what that represented, that could be an interesting tangent too.
Sure. And actually there's some fun conspiracy theories around that whole fiasco, because Silicon Valley Bank was used by obviously not only a large part of the Silicon Valley's VC and portcos, VC infrastructure and portcos, but it was also seemed to be a target for Chinese spies who were working essentially as honeypot agents to steal industrial secrets from U.S. companies. But Silicon Valley Bank was a commercial bank that mainly catered to VCs and private equity firms who held, large amounts of capital, and then also their portcos that they had recently invested in, and they offered incentives to have these like gifts and other incentives to allow companies to sign up and to incentivize companies to sign up for them as a banker, and that meant that their average size of deposit was many times larger than the average commercial bank. So the average commercial bank has a blend of customers from retail to corporate to, maybe high net worth individuals, right? Silicon Valley Bank was very, very, top heavy in terms of its focus on high net worth individuals, on private equity and VC firms. And so I think their average account size was something like $1 million. So if that tells you anything, it's pretty massive. 97% of deposits over the 250K FDIC threshold. And that meant that most of their deposits were essentially uninsured. And Silicon Valley Bank, like many banks, had gone, knee deep into treasury bonds back in 2020 and 2021 when there was a massive wave of treasury issuance and rates were at the zero bound. And the problem arose when the Treasury the Fed started hiking rates, and those Treasury bonds started to lose value because the rates and the bonds prices are inversely correlated. So as the Fed hiked, the bond prices fall. And you can check this for yourself. If you look up a ETF called TLT, which is the long bond ETF, it's fallen by about 50% since 2020. And that's basically like the 20 and 30 year long bonds. And so what that meant is that Silicon Valley suddenly had a bunch of losses, at least mark-to-market losses on their books. Now, they were able to hide part of it because of an accounting regularity that differentiated between what was called available for sale, which is AFS, and hold to maturity, which is HTM. So if you look at available for sale securities, those are securities that the bank holds that they deem liquid, that they're ready to trade, that they're ready to, deploy whenever they want to raise capital. And those are essentially marked to market as they continue to operate, right? So I think on a quarterly basis, they're forced to mark them to market and recognize losses, at least paper losses, on their balance sheet. The problem is you can also designate these bonds as what's called hold to maturity, and hold to maturity is exactly what it sounds like. It means you hold the bond until the maturity date, until you get the final payment. And if you do that, then you don't have to market to market, because you don't have to worry about where the bond is trading, because obviously where the bond is trading is also independent of where you're actually going to get the cash flows. Not completely independent, but it can be, right? So like, for example, if there was a treasury market dysfunction tomorrow and you had a treasury bill, let's say you had a 9-week bill, you could, as long as the treasury has the cash to pay you back, you could just hold the bill. You don't need to sell it and worry about where the treasury security is trading. You just hold the bill, wait till maturity, and you get your $1,000 payment. And so they started designating more and more of their securities as hold to maturity. And I believe there was here's my description of AFS and HTM. And so there was a move, not only among Silicon Valley Bank, but also among other regional commercial banks and even other large banks, to designate more and more of their portfolio as HTM, because by doing so, they would get away from marking them to market, which would show that they have actually lost their shirt on their bond portfolio. So they had been getting away with this for months. And actually, there were already rumblings that Silicon Valley Bank was insolvent as of December 2022. But it all started to come to a head in February and March of 2023. And they first went to market and tried to raise capital. That was pretty disastrous. Then they tried to assuage investors. They started to put out public statements in early and mid-March saying that they were solvent and that there was no need for a rush on the bank. But the death knell came when Peter Thiel called his portcos and essentially told all of them to pull their funds. And Peter Thiel alone and all of his portcos represented a lot of money. And so it resulted in the fastest bank run in history in about 48 hours, I believe. And I think I have the actual stat farther down. So the stock plus 50%. Then go scroll a little down. It's the next tweet. In 24 hours, 85% of SVB's bank deposits were withdrawn. So it was the fastest bank run in history. But again, you have to contextualize this. The reason why it's the fastest is because 97% of deposits are over 250K, and it's mostly portcos and VCs. So they don't have a lot of customers. They have a few customers that are very high net worth. So if you just have a large proportion of those customers come in, especially the wealthy ones come in and pull their money, you can lose all your money in a day. And that's exactly what happened to them. And they didn't even survive to the weekend. The FDIC shuttered them on a Friday morning, essentially, and put them up for receivership, in very short order. And I talked to a guy who used to work for FDIC as a roll-up analyst, essentially helping them roll up banks and put them into receivership and, deal with depositors and creditors and all their liabilities and all their assets and how to manage that. And he said that this was from him talking to his colleagues. He had retired since, but from his talking to his colleagues at the FDIC, this was the fastest, bank roll up that they'd ever done.
I'm curious, and I don't want to get you in trouble with anyone here, but we'd mentioned Peter Thiel. I mean, this guy sounds like a real jerk. What's your opinion on Peter Thiel? He seems to wield a significant amount of power in the American financial system. Are you hot or cold on him, or do you reserve judgment?
Well, I think he's an interesting character. I mean, if you'd asked me a couple of years ago, I would have been pretty pro Peter Thiel, given his more, conservative leanings, given his at least somewhat implicit, endorsement of Trump. But since then, I've become very wary of him because episodes like this are already a little concerning. But I do understand as an investor and as someone who has money at these portcos, and all these portcos are isolated to one bank, it can be very easily seen as just a self-protective move. But there's also the problem of him doing these lectures on the Antichrist that aren't allowed to be recorded or whatever. That freaks me out.
We were laughing about that because that's obviously in response to that infamous interview, where the interview more or less accused him of being the Antichrist. And so he's trying to do something where when someone searches Peter Thiel Antichrist, imagine you're that person saying, I heard that there's something about Peter Thiel being the Antichrist. Let me look that up. Oh, I see what it is. It turns out he just did a lecture series on how he's not the Antichrist. That's wicked normal. That's like a regular type thing to do.
Yeah.
And also, I also love the fact that he was a gay man who was already in shape and decided then to go on Ozempic. Like, that's a weird thing. And now he just looks messed up. This is for fat people. Just don't do this. What are you doing? He's a fucking crypt keeper. Anyway, this isn't just hanging on Peter Thiel.
It's concerning. And there's also that viral clip where they ask him, you would like humanity to survive, and he just pauses for like 20 seconds. He's just like, there's a lot of problems.
Jordan Peterson.
Like, dude, that's a very simple answer. Don't Jordan Peterson this shit. Like, say yes or no. Do you want humanity to survive? That should be an immediate yes. Like, there should be no hesitation in that answer.
Hey, Jordan, you say you're a Christian. Do you believe in Christ? Like 5 minutes later, well, what do you mean by you asking me that? Like, it just becomes this other thing. I mean, you should be able to answer this.
Yeah. What do you mean by believe? And what do you mean by Christ? And what do you mean by you? What is that? It's like, no,
the bloody thing.
Stop playing these word games, man. You know what this means. Stop doing
because if you're a psycho like myself and some others, you pay close attention to them, and you can you do see what their project is. Again, I'm not trying to hate on them, because my concern is, like, we saw Peter Thiel destroy Gawker too. Like, within 10 years, he's going to be deciding who the next pope is. Like, this guy is on a path to power that I don't think is on a lot of people's radar. Everyone's distracted by Elon Musk and his influence, which is substantial, but there are these other murky rumblings going on, and it doesn't fit neatly into any partisan discussion. That was what was interesting about, I did a whole stream with a friend of mine named King Pilled on the California ideology, about like, what is it that animates these guys politically? They're not really libertarian, they're not really liberal, they're not really conservative, they're this other thing, sort of a mishmash of them. But that's why they're so big into transhumanism, stuff like that. But I think people should be paying attention to what's going on. Like, really, what is Palantir? You should be looking at BlackRock as well. Like, all this stuff, they're almost like too big to look at for some people. They're very intimidating topics.
I agree.
So, yeah. Anyway, that was just another little tangent. So I guess we have to get going soon. Oh, Sean Weiland here. He doesn't hate the PayPal mafia. This is the type of thing I'm talking about. This is what he gets into. The PayPal mafia is what that's colloquially what Peter Thiel's outfit was known as. You know, they're sort of these financial gunslingers. And I mean, they're interesting personalities, but it's difficult to divine their longer term agenda other than, and I do believe they're honest when they say they want to expand humanity throughout the cosmos. And Mark Andreessen is big on this as well. A lot of the richest people you've ever heard of are into this. So, you know, I think there are economic, because that really ties into what we've been talking about sort of the dollar dominance. Like, where do these movers of capital, where do they choose to place it here and operate within America? So they must know something, and they seem to be propping up a great deal of the American technology, because it's not just economic dominance. To me, it's technology dominance as well. As cool as Japan might be, hey, look, we all love Asian girls with a streak of purple hair. We all miss cyberpunk. I get it, but there's really not a lot going on over there compared to America.
No, there's not. And, you know, so one of my favorite, if you're interested in learning more about Japan and the yen, there's a great Substack writer by the name of Weston Nakamura. He's a former Goldman Sachs and Jefferies equities derivatives trader, and now he writes full-time on the Bank of Japan only. And when we went and filmed a documentary over there with him, I remember we were walking around. Yeah, this is him. Great analyst. I go for most of my Bank of Japan research. But he was like pointing this out to me. He was like, can you name the Japanese Mark Zuckerberg? Can you name the Japanese Elon Musk? He's like, where's the Japanese Silicon Valley? He's like, there isn't one. You know, and most Asian countries, that's the problem, is that the actual innovation is much lower than that of the West. And I think, again, it's because of these creativity and openness differences between the demographies, right? So it just makes it like Japan is extremely good at optimizing. They're extremely good at creating efficiencies and at producing things, high quality things at better and better cost points over time, right? That's why they dominated the manufacturing and the electronics industries so well. And I own a Honda, right? And before that I had a Toyota. I love Japanese cars. But their actual ability to innovate is extremely low. And you look at outside of their cultural influence with anime, like that one super chatter said, and, you know, some music, there's not much innovation there, right? There's not many apps that are formed there. There's not many, you know, private investors. If you look at private capital markets in Japan, they essentially just invest in bonds and like boring instruments. They don't really do angel investing there like they do here. You know, here in Seattle, for example, there's like a couple different angel alliances. If you want to start a business, you can go pitch your business idea at an angel alliance. If you get big enough, you can go pitch at a VC. You can go to Silicon Valley. There's all these forms of capital you can tap into, and there's investors with millions of dollars willing to do that. In Japan, no one wants to take that risk because they've been in a state of zero growth for decades. And since there's been so little innovation and so little, you know, actual new idea formation, there's no risks that anyone wants to take. And so it's just created a kind of zombified economy.
Yeah, and I think that's what, when I tune into Richard Werner now and he speaks on Japan, I mean, Princes of the Yen was the main one we covered, and that's from a couple decades ago, I think. It's quite old. It's a timeless book, but things have evolved since then, especially where it ends, which is around the late 90s, I think. He really gets into the end there, but where's it progressed since then? And yeah, Japan is a very illustrative case. And we do need to get going soon, but I wonder, is there anything in this thread that develops any ideas? The battle has begun for the future of the global monetary system. The fate of the superpower hangs in the balance. Bretton Woods 3, economic warfare. What can we say about Bretton Woods 3?
So if I remember right, let me just scan through the thread. the point of this thread. Oh, okay. Yes. The point of the thread was, how is the U.S. today losing control of the modern economic system, right? And so first I lay out the problem of Triffin's dilemma, which you can see there, which basically delineated between allowing the dollar to, or allowing the U.S. to continually export dollars and to have run trade deficits and current account deficits, which meant sending more dollars abroad than we receive, which would continue to fund the global system, but at the cost of devaluing our currency, essentially, especially with regards to gold. We'd break the gold peg eventually, or not doing that. And if you don't do that, there's not enough dollars and dollar liquidity outside the U.S. to fund global trade, which means the global financial system starts to enter, a freezing period, a seize up. You can think of it as a deflationary winter, right? And Triffin wrongly assumed, if you read his writings, that we would go the deflationary path, that the U.S. would basically stop doing, trade deficits and current account deficits, and that we would allow the global financial system to seize up and that there would be a global depression. Instead, the opposite happened. We continued to fund the deficits and we continued to print money and send it abroad and spend it on wars, the Great Society programs, and all the other, guns and butter stuff of the 1960s. And what followed was a global wave of inflation. And in the aftermath of that, like we said earlier, the U.S. and other players in the world started to move towards this new, what I would call a new form of Bretton Woods, which is Bretton Woods 2, which is using the dollar and fiat currency and specifically the treasury as the new global reserve asset and the dollar as its currency. And by doing so, the treasury became essentially the global capital liquidity pool into which all money could be put into, right? Because all these dollars are flowing abroad into U.S. and foreign corporations, into foreign banks, into foreign private high net worth individuals, and all those people are buying U.S. stocks and buying U.S. treasuries, and so that capital just flowed back into the U.S. The problem is obviously now this is what I'm terming Bretton Woods 3, which, by the way, it's not even my term. There's a brilliant macro analyst, much smarter than me, named Zoltan Pozar, who has been writing about this, I believe at Citigroup. But also he has to work for the Fed. I think it was the New York Fed, and their monetary plumbing. And now he has his own publication where he writes for $30,000 a year subscription. So you have to pay a lot of money to read him if you want to have all of his stuff. But he's been talking about how the system has been evolving, and obviously how we're going to be moving and transitioning to the next system, and how we know that the transitions are happening. And so one of the things I point out in this is the reduction in total purchasing as a share of purchasing of treasuries as a share of central bank, foreign central bank buying. So you look at 2008 to 2015, foreign central banks bought, and if you go a little further down, I think it'll have this chart. I don't know if I put it in this thread. I thought I did. But if you look here it is. So if you go from 2008 to 2015, from the foreigners bought $5 trillion of total U.S. debt issued, meaning on net they funded 71% of our debt issuance. And then from 2014, 2015 to 2021, 2022, they bought only 14%. So essentially, what that meant is that even though you see the total federal debt holdings of foreign central banks rising, their ability to swallow our debt is decreasing, and eventually, obviously, that's going to be zero on the foreign central bank side. Now, there's still private demand. There's still high net worth individuals that are still buying treasuries. I'm not saying that treasury demand is going to collapse tomorrow. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying this is a signpost that other central banks, which are obviously closely tied to their government, are trying to move away, especially from long-term treasury debt. And so they've been, for example, transitioning to buying gold in large amounts. And so 2022, 2023, 2024 were all record years for gold central bank buying. And so that indicates to me that we're entering a new era of Bretton Woods, and what happens and what comes next is going to be much different than what we've seen before.
I know we're going to go right about now, but I wanted to just carry that thought a bit further. Are you optimistic about the future? Another big question I'm just plopping in your lap, but a lot of people would predict the total collapse of the economy, the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. We sound like we're forecasting quite the opposite. Are you optimistic? What do you think? That it's impossible to predict everything, but what are your feelings over the next 10 years, let's say?
Well, I would say I have that book, right, which is it's a hyperbolic, like attention grabbing title. And the point of the book is not to doomerize, which I know is I probably should have picked a better title if I wanted to not doomerize, but because it is a bit of a doomer title. But the point of the book is to lay out the case that like this change of reserve currencies eventually is inevitable. And for the U.S. as the holder of the reserve currency, we have the most to lose. When Britain lost their reserve currency, they lost all their colonies, they lost essentially all their foreign capital markets, and they lost a large portion of their global influence, right? And luckily they didn't have a hyperinflation because their debt levels hadn't been accelerated to an extreme point that they would never be paid off, right? And there's obviously devaluation and a lot of money printing and inflation during the war periods. I think British inflation was north of 20%. But if you look at the U.S. and where it's at now, it represents, I think, a dangerous point, because if we transition to a new global reserve currency, especially if one comes up that's better than the dollar, it could represent a pretty quick transition between global reserve currencies, which would mean that the dollar would lose a large portion of its demand, right? Which would essentially mean that treasuries, equities, all these other things would face much more downward pressure. And if the Fed doesn't want to see a bear market in the US, they'd have to print more money. And so that just means a lot of inflation would be coming down the pipeline. But all this is contingent on the moves that the players make. Because like, let's say, for example, Bitcoin is not adopted as a global reserve currency. Let's say we just kind of muddle through with just gold and we just kind of like slowly move towards a more multipolar world. The dollar would, in that case, die a slow death. And we just see slowly divesting treasuries, especially long bonds, and slowly getting out of dollar debt. And then, more of a move towards the equity side and especially the gold side. And so the global central banks and foreigners would be just using gold as an intermediary settlement mechanism rather than treasuries as a reserve asset.
You hear that, everyone? Whatever you were predicting is going to happen is probably wrong. That's the type of information I like to hear. We got a lot of doomers out there. And hey, guess what? If there's doom, it's going to be a weird type of doom that you've never predicted. Now, I want to throw a couple of plugs your way. This is because I knew you primarily from X. And I didn't know that you had a booming YouTube channel. But we were saying this before the show, I was deeply impressed by the video work they've been coming up with and these documentaries they've been working on. So check this out, everyone. Peruvian Bull on YouTube. Also, here's his Substack, the Dollar Endgame, updated fairly regularly, very popular Substack. So check both those out. All the information you could ever want on this topic is there. And I just had the book up, which I haven't read, but I'm going to give that a purchase soon. And maybe we'll probably cover that on the show once my insane backlog of books is worked through. We have some terrible shit coming down the pipeline. Because we like to get into conspiracy theories a bit on the show too. And we've exhausted all the main ones. So we're just really left with all the schizo stuff, which it varies wildly in quality. You might find for every good, interesting idea, there's 20 just really bad ideas. There's this one we covered not long ago. A lot of people love this one. It was called Time Cube. Have you ever heard of Time Cube?
No, I haven't.
And it was about, I'm going to explain it to you. It really is just schizophrenic ramblings on an old like Web 1.0 type site. A lot of people read that back in the day and they still hold accountable for it. But it was this idea that every day actually contains 4 days. And so that's the time cube. And then so just immediately hear that and you say, well, I mean, a cube has more than 4 sides. Like, do you mean a Times Square? Like right from the jump, it's retarded. And then it just gets into like all kinds of crazy stuff. Every day is actually 4 days. And so it almost, and like, okay, let's say that's true. What does that mean? Who cares? What? Like that just, it's like a time zone thing. I don't know. Anyway, we covered that on a live stream a while ago. Once you get to the bottom of conspiracy theories, you'd think you'd find the really interesting sediment, but it's not. It's actually just insane people misreading things and like misunderstanding like TV shows and shit. Anyway, I gave those are the plugs. Everyone check that out. Peruvian bull Roberto, thank you so much for taking the time. This is one of my top streams. I love having guys like you and Tom Longo and Stormy Waters on. And once we figure out what this Bank of England's up to, I'm sure we can get everyone together again.
Yeah, that'd be great. I actually am I'm going to start working on a piece on the gilt crisis and the Bank of England and their role in 2022 when that market blew up. So, but really, I would learn from people who are much more experienced than me. So, Deer Point Macro, I was really happy to see him in the chat. Also, I'll just give him a shout out here, even though he's not asking for it. Give him a follow. He's a great macro guy, and Luke Groman, also great. Same with Brent Johnson. Those are three of the people that I'd say, like, if you want to learn macro, especially like intelligent, deep dive macro, and not the New York Times kind of like lame, liberal, limp-wristed, like, what's happening with bubblegum? You need to go follow those guys. So,
yeah, as we were recording this, I went and followed multiple people as you were name dropping them. So I think some other people should follow suit if you're interested in this stuff. There's a lot of interesting thinkers out there, but I particularly like this one. So anyway, gotta get going, but thank you again. And thank you everyone for